Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I just would like to acknowledge that we're slightly early, but hey, everybody's here, I think, and it's a pleasure to see you. I'm Michael Howe, the current President of RUSI New South Wales, and I'd just like to thank you very much for attending and supporting today's event. If we could move straight into it, I'd like to recognise and pay tribute to First Nations people, and also particularly to those who have served, are serving, or are thinking of serving in our ADF. It is now my pleasure to invite our event coordinator, Ron Lyons, if he could introduce our guest speaker for today. Over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the sixth of our lecture series for 2023. The overall theme of our activities in this half year is the implications of the Defence Strategic Review, and the title of today's lecture is The Solomon Islands, a Target for Dystopian Aggression in the Pacific. It'll be presented by Lieutenant Colonel John Howells, who is stepping out from behind the camera today. John joined the Institute in 1969 as part of his some 30 years of service with the Army Reserve. With his civilian IT skills, he became our webmaster in 2004 and has continued to provide us with top quality technical support to extend the Institute's reach and profile across the electronic spectrum. In 2013, following the end of Operation Anode in the Solomons, John was invited to conduct tours of the World War II Solomon Islands battlefields. In the process, he came to know the islands, their inhabitants, and their history. In his lecture, he will give us an insight into the current situation of one of our most strategically important Pacific Islands neighbours. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome John Howells to the podium.
Thank you, Ron, for that very, very kind introduction, probably too kind. In talking about the Solomon Islands, I want you to recognise that you are getting the views of a military history tour guide. A former soldier, yes, but not a person with studied experience. I will roughly cover the geography, history and culture of the nation in an attempt to discover why the Solomon Islands is a target for a dystopic power with an expansionist agenda and how it can be targeted. Starting with the geography. The Solomon Islands are about 2,000 kilometres northeast of Queensland, on a direct line between California and Australia. There are 6 main islands and many smaller ones. Here are some statistics. That is the Solomon Islands flag. Interesting, the 5 stars do not signify the Southern Cross, but the 5 provinces of the Solomons. The religion stat is interesting. The missionaries did their job, and there could be something in it. At the end of a tour, on the day of leaving, the skies opened, there was a tropical downpour. The Archbishop of Canterbury was visiting. His plane stopped 100 metres from the terminal. It could not be seen for the heavy rain. Then, as he left and walked from the plane, the rain stopped, a dry transition. Not so dry with the school children waiting in their drenched uniforms. The main island is Guadalcanal. It has the capital Honiara thereon. The second island is Melita. The capital Honiara. Honiara is a pretty small town. Looks like a nice place to live. It is the port. The main roads are paved, but you do not have to go too far to get to dirt, and when it rains, bog. The Governor-General's car is a four-wheel drive. The locals, however, do not all live as an Australian would be accustomed, and the red beetle nut stains on the footpaths tell a story. Electricity is diesel generated. Solar panels are encouraged. Feeding the excess solar into the grid and storage for peak usage, as in New South Wales, has not been properly addressed. This market and village to the west of the town was once prone to youngsters speeding in well above the 80 kilometres an hour island limit, causing deaths. The locals fixed that. Speed troughs, 1 metre deep, 2 metres wide, take out almost any vehicle suspension. The surrounding country is quite rugged. Rural living is basic. At least the houses do not need to be heated in winter. Mosquitoes are a problem. Malaria is endemic. The nation is an archipelago. Most inter-island communication is by powered skiff. And the seas can be quite rough. This is crossing Iron Bottom Sound. Of this I do have personal experience. The dome head is me. The archipelago was first settled around 30,000 BCE, well before New Zealand and long after Australia. Most Europeans on site were Spanish, who coined the name. In the 1890s, there was a spate of Pacific island grabbing by European nations. The British grabbed the Solomons, though not all of the archipelago. The Germans grabbed Bougainville to the north. 1978 saw the nation of the Solomon Islands born. Moving on. We will now consider the latter history in more detail. It tells us why a dystopian aggressor would be interested in the real estate. The aggressor in the Second World War fully understood the significance of the location of the Solomon Islands on a direct line from the US to Australia. A base on the Solomons could deny the US access to the vast area and resources of Australia. A firm base for the US to drive north, island by island, to Japan. By August 1942, Japan was well on the way to establishing the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere by driving the US and Europeans out and dominating China. In the strikes south and east so far, there have only been 2 defeats, Midway and the Coral Sea. Land bases thus being seen as more reliable for aircraft launch pads than carriers. There were no defenders in the Solomon Islands when the Japanese invaded in May 1942. Then, as now, there was no defence force, only police. The British Commissioner, William Marchant, left his bungalow at Tulagi overlooking the then port to organise coast watches. Sadly, only the foundations of his grand house survive. After the Japanese landed on the main island of Guadalcanal, airfield construction began. An unsinkable base astride the sea highway between the United States and Australia. In the quiet waters adjacent to Tulagi, on the islands of Tanambagu and Gatavu, the Japanese developed a seaplane base. The Americans struck back close to midnight on the 6-7 August 1942. A carrier-based force delivered the 1st Marine Division to the islands. One Marine Division were the only formation available. Their weaponry, World War I vintage. 3,000 Marines struck Tulagi, with the remainder of the force, some 11,000, landing at Red Beach, 5 kilometres each of Laguna Point, where the Japanese were airfield building. On the next evening, the 8th 9th August, aggressive action by the Japanese Navy was not anticipated. Several ships were lost, including the cruiser HMAS Canberra. The Tulagi landing was on the southwestern side of the island. A US Marine battalion and a Raider battalion then fought their way through the rugged terrain against fierce resistance from Imperial Japanese Navy troops, some 800 of them. None of the Japanese survived, either dying in battle or committing suicide. The island's cricket pitch was taken, and defenders had to be dangerously dealt with in tunnel complexes. The landing at Red Beach, about 5 clicks east of the airfield, on the morning of the 7th of August was unopposed. As the soldiers exited their landing craft, they could hear the sounds of the fierce fighting across 35 kilometres of what was to become known as Iron Bottom Sound, due to the ships lying there resulting from a number of naval engagements over the next few months. Pushing inland, when they reached the airfield, they found it abandoned. The forced Korean labourers, about 3,000 of them, and their limited number of guards, about 200, had taken to the jungle on the overlooking Mount Austin, where this photo was taken. The Japanese reacted quickly. Forces were dispatched from the Philippines, Palau and Guam. The first element to arrive was 917 men, part of a regimental-sized unit around 3,000 under Colonel Ichiki from Guam. With little intelligence as to the size of the US force he was facing, Ichiki decided to move quickly with what he had, taking advantage of the Americans settling in and not having an effective defensive perimeter in place. He moved quickly with his available force to the edge of what was the US now called Henderson Field, after an aviator lost at Midway. There they met the Alligator River on the 21st of August, just short of the Milne Bay date 25 of August. The river being a creek inhabited with saltwater crocodiles. And along it were the American defenders, with a well laid out perimeter, including machine guns sighted to take advantage of the fire lanes created by the creek. The Japanese attacking force was all but annihilated. The commander suicided. This memorial stands atop a mass grave that holds the bodies of the brave Japanese. The Japanese, now reinforced, circled round to take the airfield from the south. The attack was met by Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and repulsed. This is the battle where Sergeant John Baslone won the Congressional Medal of Honor. On one tour, a US Marine in the group left a unit coin in his honour. Some Australian units now have these coins. I am circulating a couple. I either want the coins returned or $20 each. They can be bought online. Attempts to retake the airfield were made by the Japanese, with landings east and west of Laguna Point through September to November. In all of this we come to Evans Carlson.
Lieutenant Colonel, later Brigadier General Evans Carlson, was the commander of the 2nd Raider Battalion at Guadalcanal. He had been the philosophical father of the US Marine Raiders. He was a man who had risen from the ranks in the Army in World War I and again in the Marines in the 1920s. He was posted with the US Marines to China on 2 occasions, and then finally set back a 3rd time in 1937 as an official student of the Chinese language and military observer with the Chinese forces. There he was afforded the opportunity to learn the tactics of the Japanese soldier. He met Chinese communist leaders such as Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, travelling thousands of kilometres through the interior of China with the communist guerrillas, often on foot or on horseback over the most hazardous terrain. He lived under the same primitive conditions.
He was impressed by the tactics used by the Chinese communist guerrillas to fight Japanese troops. He drew on what he learnt there, a philosophy of cooperation between all ranks and the mentoring of junior officers by senior soldiers, along with the Mao force's impressive tactics when forming the raiders. He is depicted here being decorated for his work on the Solomons. And a very useful piece of work it was. Initially sent as an airfield construction defence party, when this endeavour was abandoned due to poor sighting, a long patrol harassing and driving Japanese from the country east of Henderson Field was conducted. In October, the Japanese pushed from the west, taking a vantage point at Gifu village overlooking Honiara from the south. Met solidly by US forces that now included 2 army divisions, the attempted incursions heading for Henderson Field withdrew south and then west. At Gifu by December, the Japanese were out of rations and very low in ammunition, though still able to hold off attacks from their strong bunkers. It took 3 of these ascending to the heights to destroy the bunkers and see them off. By February 1943, the ever-increasing strength of the US force and the failing capability of the Tokyo Express, the name given to nightly forays by the IJN through the slot between the parallel lines of islands that headed from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, Japanese gave up. They withdrew on the 7th of February. Memorials including this for HMAS Canberra in Honiara give testament. In the aftermath of World War II, the legacy of the US presidents and the Japanese guilt-based investment made Guadalcanal Island and Honiara in particular the place to be. Other islanders were drawn in and tensions erupted. They came to a head after a soccer match. 2 armed rival factions emerged in the crisis. The Istanbul Freedom Movement claimed indigenous rights to the land on Guadalcanal and wanted the Militants to move out. The Melita Eagles Force were fighting for land and buildings left behind in Honiara by Militants who fled Guadalcanal. Add to this the triads from Taiwan, and there was real trouble. By 2002, Solomon Islands was a failing state. Murder on the streets by the opposing forces was common. The police were powerless and there was no defence force. Parliament was not functioning and the institutions of government were not working. In 2003, Australia and New Zealand organised a coalition of Pacific Islands police and defence forces to intervene and restore order. Initially, the soldiers were all regular, like these New Zealanders. The non-criminal locals welcomed them with open arms. Order was restored and the population disarmed. As the situation stabilised, the regular Australian soldiers, much needed for more pressing engagements, were replaced by reservists on 6-month rotations, 2 months training, followed by 6 months deployment. The reservists, themselves part of the civil community, were empathetic to the locals and found to be well suited to the task of keeping the peace. Diving a bit more into the Solomon Islands culture can give us a bit of an insight as to how a dystopic power can target the nation. The war legacy is everywhere and the contribution by the locals helping the US and Australia is emphasised. Japanese war guilt is poignantly displayed, as is the triumph of the USA. The war is also ever present in a more sinister way. The bombardment, air and sea, of Henderson Field and the nearby city of Honiara has left a deadly legacy of unexploded ordnance. This facility trains locals in the task of bomb retrieval and disposal. It is manned day and night. 3 sleep on the premises, awaiting a call from the police to deal with a live bomb or shell. Defence is necessary. The location includes a range where ordnance can be destroyed. The site was set up by a group of retired US soldiers who have trained and pay the locals. Relics of the war are a source of income for the locals. Best if you line up visits with a local guide who will tell you how much in an envelope or brown paper bag to deliver to the local headman so your tour group can visit a site or see a relic. A culture readily transferable to politicians. A problem with the relics is the tropical environment. This is not Latrun, where the dry air of the Negev preserves the relics of Israeli armour. Here we have heat, rain and sea air. Relics are fading away, yet where else would tourists be drawn to them other than in this idyllic setting? Finance is a consideration for custodians. When I was seen with a small video camera, I was asked to pay more. I could be a film crew. Speaking of politics, until 2018 this boat, the one at the top, was available to take tour groups around the islands. After an election, the politician who owned it used the boat to take a group of trusted supporters to his home island for a party. As the party progressed, the candidate he beat organised for a group of his supporters to shoot up and sink the vessel. No more tourist boat. Hence the rough crossing. One incident did concern me. On one of my crossings of Iron Bottom Sound, we ran across a boat full of locals, stopped in the calm waters. They had run out of petrol, about 10 clicks out of Honiara, and were not carrying oars. The Australian expat who owned the boat we were on would not give them a tow, as it would use more costly diesel. It took an offer to pay to see the family group taken in tow. The boat owner did not take the money. He was sufficiently shamed to deliver the necessary public service. No piece of Solomon Islands culture would be complete without something said about panpipers. A local tourism authority official organised this group for me on the last evening of a tour. They were supposed to arrive at 1900. They arrived at 2200. The melody is great to jive to, if not repetitive. In 2019, the Solomon Islands withdrew diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and recognised China instead. This was not welcomed by all in business and politics. Solomon Islands Prime Minister Sogavare declared lockdown on Wednesday the 25th of November 2021 after about 1,000 people gathered in protest at the capital demanding his resignation over a host of domestic issues. The protesters breached the National Parliament building and burned the thatched roof of a nearby building. They also set fire to a police station and other buildings. On the 25th of November 2021, Australia announced a detachment of 23 federal police officers and up to 50 more to provide security at critical infrastructure sites. as well as 43 Defence Force personnel, a patrol boat and at least 5 diplomats. The first personnel left Australia on the 25th of November, with more going on the 26th. Many of the protesters were from Melita, whose Premier, Daniel Suidani, has been at odds with Sogavare, whom he accuses of being too close to Beijing. Days of rioting saw thousands ignore the government lockdown order, torching several buildings in and around the Chinatown district, including commercial properties and a bank branch. Australian peacekeepers were still on the ground when on the 30th of March 2022, China and the Solomon Islands signed an agreement where, according to the leaked draft of a segment on the screen, Solomon Islands may, according to its own needs, request China to send police, armed police, military personnel and other law enforcement and armed forces to the Solomon Islands to assist in maintaining social order, protecting people's lives and property. That seems innocuous enough. Do note that the agreement has not been released, only leaks of the draft. Apart from those privy to the document, the contents are secret. There has been some clarification, with the Solomon Islands Prime Minister stating in a press conference in July 2022, "Let me reassure you, there is no military base nor any other military facility or institutions in the agreement." And I think that's a very important point that we continue to emphasise to the family of Pacific nations. So in conclusion, the Solomon Islands is a nation in the right or wrong place depending on your point of view, a nation with a small economy, a nation with a volatile population and political environment, a nation with no defence force, a nation with a big heart, easy prey for a good offer. Thanks for listening to my diatribe. At least I hope you enjoyed the pictures. Happy to take any questions, but whilst you think through the questions that will hit me like slings and arrows, you might consider this more complete extract from the draft of the China-Solomon Islands Agreement, specifically this last part. A bit like the extraterritorial laws applied by foreign nations to China in the 19th and early 20th century. And in July 2022, the agreement saw $4 million worth of police equipment, including vehicles and drones, supplied by China to the Solomon Islands Police. Police officers were also trained in the Chinese way of policing. Now let us get to the questions.
Hi, Patrick Lewis, USI UK New South Wales. Just with the Chinese agreement that they have with the police and the military, are we aware since then of any, even a low-level presence of Chinese police or military on the islands?
Well, oh yes. You saw there the guys who'd been trained, and you saw the presentation ceremony. They've got Chinese police over in the Solomon Islands doing the training. And like I said, $4 million, which doesn't sound anything like when you talk about submarines and things, but $4 million worth of stuff for the Solomon Islands Police, for them, is big deal. Drones, vehicles, equipment, you saw all the equipment they had. Solomon Islands didn't have that much before then. There are Chinese police there now. And of course, there are many other Chinese of various types that are in there. Don't forget, my last time in the Solomons was 2017. I was supposed to go in 2019, but COVID struck.
John Howells, RUSI. In the colonial history, Germany's impact, has any lasting legacy of German colonisation of the area? That's it.
Well, don't forget that the Germans grabbed Bougainville, and Bougainville's not part of the Solomons today. So what you've got is this this British legacy, but the British only ever had a protectorate. They had a protectorate right up until the granting of independence. And the protectorate had a British resident, a bit like they've got in the Cayman Islands today, and a limited British presence. The local police were really not reinforced by British soldiery, such that you had the situation where the resident commissioner, who is written up well in history as being a very competent fellow, was off organising coast watches from whomsoever he could get. So not much Kraut stuff. No names like Saddleberg.
Fred Chilton, thanks John. A couple of comments from when we visited in 13 and 14, where our daughter was teaching one of the schools. Two things you didn't mention were the difference in the land titles situation between Malaita and Guadalcanal. On Guadalcanal, it's a female inheritance. So quite a few Malaitans marry Guadalcanalese females to get the title of the land. Secondly, in the primary schools they teach in English to an English curriculum, and yet most of the teachers don't speak English properly. And as was pointed out to us, the teachers get moved around and they have to go to Honiara to collect their pay before they move. So quite often a teacher appointed to a school in an outlying area, Gizo or even in Malaya, had to hang around in Honiara for a few months. So instead of starting school in January, they may not get there till June or July, etc. So all of that is when you've got undereducated people, they're not taught in their native language. All of that leads to problems when those people become teenagers or young adults, because very few of them are capable of doing any sort of skilled work.
Yeah, and the aspect there during the first troubles, of course, was that a lot of the workers were from outside Guadalcanal. And the whole thing in Guadalcanal started in the countryside, in the southern part of the island. And they moved up toward Guadalcanal, toward Honiara, which was relatively prosperous, and most of the jobs were taken by outsiders who had come into Honiara, and so you had this problem. But from what I saw, the problem had a lid on it during the time that I was there, which was really 2013 to 2019, and but there was always something there. They would tell you if someone was not a local, for what they called a local. And the example there of the of the speed reducing humps or speed reducing troughs is just a straight out thing. The government did nothing about it. They've got the Japanese put in this beautiful road, runs along the northern coast of Guadalcanal, and that's where the kids were really screaming, and they'd scream into the town, and that the market was on the edge of the town and little kids out in the road and what have you. So the locals dealt with it. When the government couldn't deal with it, the locals dealt with it. But by the cripes, when you get there, and your tourist bus has to go down into a ditch and drive around and come up, they certainly don't approach, you just certainly don't approach it at 80 kilometres an hour.
But certainly when we were there, the Chinese were not obvious. The Chinese ran, as they do in New Guinea, or did in New Guinea, most of the shops and things. They owned them all, but you never saw them. It was a local fronting up, and they were in a back room. And I had said to my daughter, where are the Chinese? And we only saw any Chinese on Friday night at the Hotel Honiara, where there were big swags of Chinese families celebrating together. So it was, I don't think, there's no love really for the Chinese. And it might be a bit like Fiji. the reaction recently with the change of government.
Yeah.
But Sogavare is regarded by most of the locals as being on the take.
Oh, yeah.
From Chinese.
Yeah. Oh, there's no question about that. The locals would tell you about the fact that they would show you the house that's being built for the Prime Minister, which would be, you saw the other houses that everyone lives in. This was something magnificent.
David Lee's the former president of RUSI. Thank you, John, for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if Australia had to intervene militarily in the Solomon Islands in a hot war situation. We had to make a landing in Honeygat, or make a landing somewhere in the Solomons. Presumably we'd either have to be in Guadalcanal or Malacca. I'm wondering what airfields, good airfields there are, other than Henderson Field. I'm also wondering what suitable beaches might be available on both Guadalcanal and Malacca, other than the beaches used by the Americans and the Japanese during World War II.
I'm not too good on this. I do know that, because I've only ever been to Guadalcanal and Tulagi. And I'd heard that the Chinese are very interested in Tulagi. Tulagi is very good for seaplane base, but not another base. There are good beaches all around. The reason why the Americans went into the beaches to the east of Honiara was that Red Beach is a really nice long beach, plenty of room to bring stuff in. The beaches on the other side, which is where the Japanese, where the Tokyo Express used to come in, is again a nice broad beach, plenty of stuff. You saw there where it can whip up a surf of some kind and 1 to 2 metre waves, but not that much more than that because it's completely surrounded by islands. The airfields, every island has got an airfield, or every major island, the 6 major islands have got airfields which are capable of taking not necessarily a 777 or a 767, but certainly the one down from that, and they'd be quite effective for any landing. And there's a couple there. The one you saw that Carlson was heading for, and I mentioned Carlson because it's something that I only covered bits and pieces of World War II. But someone threw me on Carlson when I was on a tour and said, "Oh, what do you know about Carlson?" And I had to immediately go away and read up what I could. It's an interesting story in terms of who that guy was, what his background was. And that airfield, when they chose to go there, they hadn't done the survey properly, and you saw the kinds of mountains that are there, and in some cases they are very close to the coast. Out around Laguna and what have you, no, it's back far enough for there to be plenty of good flight paths, etc. But when you get down to the extremities, it comes in very, very close to the coast. So the opportunity for additional airfields may be reduced. And I haven't seen, has anyone been to Tonga and seen the beautiful port facility that the Chinese have put in there? Yeah. They haven't done that in the Solomons yet. You still have to, if you come in on a cruise ship, you've got to dive into the boat out the back and come in.
Alan Murray is my name, just a RUSI member. My question is, I was in the Solomons in 2012, 2013, in and around Honiara, in conjunction with Openo. And the period I was there, I struggled to identify anything of economic significance that goes on there. And I'm just wondering, have you identified anything since of economic significance that might drive any growth in their economy?
Well, the big thing that was making money in their economy, apart from tourism, and the tourism aspects there, they've got a couple of good hotels. There's a really good hotels, but it's last time I was there, it was about $500 a night, which is a little heavy, and that's 2017 when I was there last. But the big thing that they had was this palm oil, and palm oil was killed by the Troubles. So there is potential there. Yes, Fred?
I was just going to add, are you aware, or anyone else here aware, of any moves by Australian and US government in the line of countering Chinese aggression in the area to put in more civilian facilities? Because the hospital, if I recall rightly, was built by the Taiwanese, but it was staffed by not very well educated doctors. And we met someone who was turned into a paraplegic because she was operated on in the hospital. And given you didn't talk about cargo cult mentality, but it's still
It's there. It's there. Yeah.
Post World War II, it hasn't gone away.
I think at the start of my presentation I showed a landing craft that was gradually rusting away. And boy, if you go down that inlet and you haven't made arrangements in Honiara, they will come out with the canoes and the whatever they've got. There is that sort of mentality that, and of course the cargo cult works best for the politicians.
Folks, it is my pleasure to both say thank you to John and in a wider sense pay tribute to the role that John has done. And in starting, I wonder if you, like me, wondered what the hell dystopian meant. So I'll be honest enough to say I looked it up on Wikipedia, which obviously is the source of all knowledge, and it's relating to a society or state where there is great suffering or injustice, and it's an adverb. An adjective. And I guess if I could reflect a couple of things that occurred to me as I was listening, because I hope each of you form your own view. Firstly, I thought of Papua New Guinea and I wondered how much of it is parallel. I wondered, is democracy a concept that comes from an Anglo-Saxon community and an Anglo-Saxon background rather than something that is widely shared and widely accepted across the states? The current PNG situation, for example, the Prime Minister there is quite open in saying, we are neutral and we're ready to deal with anyone who will advantage Papua New Guinea. And it seems to me that the kindest version of what John has shared with us is that they are cultures that don't get on that well at times. There are cultures that get on well at times, and they're cultures that will do what is of advantage to them. And if you are Sogavare, you're sitting on that melting pot. So could I just simply say that I don't know what your reflection was, but I sat there thinking, aren't I privileged that I came from a background that doesn't tend to deal with these issues in the way that those people have to deal with these issues? And then bluntly I thought of First Nations. Are you aware, for example, that approximately half of the western of the Aboriginal communities are female-dominated tribes, whereas eastern Aboriginal communities are male-dominated tribes? So in that sense, what I just reflected on was the complexity of very complex societies, how you make them work, particularly when you apply the logic that we all have the same vote, as distinct from 400 years ago. Well, yes, boss, it was pretty clear who owned us and all of that stuff. Now, I'm not asking you to agree. All I'm doing is sharing with you some of the reflections that John's presentation created for me, and I hope that you sat there thinking, do I live in a very privileged society, and is this something I can stand back and look at, or is this something that I should share and deal with? And of course, if you're a serving ADF member, it's a little bit more direct than that, because you might need to be involved in serving it or solving it. Could I, John, just say how much I enjoyed the preparation that you put in, the excellent travelogue, the excellent use of PowerPoint. And I'm not sure whether you're aware of it or not, but some of the technology that John was blending for us was pretty good quality stuff. And I just would like to pay compliment, John, to the quality of the presentation, and thank you very much for that.